Listen carefully. Because this story does not begin with a battle. It does not begin with a war cry or a shifted wolf racing through dark territory or the clash of two alpha males fighting over the same ground. Those things come later, in different stories, for different men. This story begins with a sound so small that almost no one in the room would have caught it. A growl, low, involuntary, barely formed before it was swallowed back down, the kind of sound a man makes when his body betrays him before his mind can stop it. The kind of sound that is not a command and not a warning and not the kind of controlled force an Alpha King is supposed to project at the Blood Moon gathering. It was the sound of something breaking open. Montgomery Emberfang heard it, but he had spent 14 years at Zev Ashfang's side, and he knew every sound the man made, the measured authority of the commands, the low warning of the territorial alerts, the particular clipped silence that meant a decision had already been made, and no further argument would be heard. He had never heard this one before. He went very still, and Zev Ashfang, Alpha King of 4 territories, the most feared wolf in the Northern Pack Alliance, a man who had walked through 3 years of inter-pack war and come out the other side still standing, stood frozen at the entrance of Mooncrest Lodge like a man who had just stepped onto ice he did not know was there. The Blood Moon gathering was everything it was supposed to be. Firelight, 300 pack members moving in the comfortable choreographed rhythms of a formal evening, to the Stoneclaw family near the east window, talking with the easy confidence of wolves who have been attending these gatherings for generations. The Wolfhearts at the long table, Preston Wolfheart leaning back in the way he always did, unhurried and comfortable in his own skin. The younger wolves at the edges of the hall, holding their ceremonial amber drinks and performing relaxation while watching everything. The ceremonial drums beginning their low, slow heartbeat in the corner, the smell of pine smoke and cold earth and the sweet, sharp edge of the Blood Moon wine that only came out twice a year. Zev registered none of it, because across the firelit hall in ivory and amber, Catherine Mooncrest was laughing, not performing laughter, not calibrating the angle of her smile for the room's benefit, or not turning her joy outward toward an audience the way you learn to at pack gatherings, when every expression you make is noted and filed and discussed later. Simply laughing, head tilted back, eyes shut for just a moment, guard so completely and genuinely down that the sound of it traveled the length of the hall and reached him before he had even fully registered her presence in the crowd. That laugh. He had not heard it in 14 months. He had told himself, in the deliberate, practiced way of a man who governs his own internal world with the same iron discipline he brings to governing his territories, that he did not miss it, that the absence of it was manageable, that 14 months of administrative precision and political responsibility and the careful, dysfunctional arrangement he had built with Theodora had successfully filled the space where that sound used to live. The growl said otherwise, and the man standing beside her, broad-shouldered, open-faced, warm in the specific way of a man who has stopped pretending that warmth is weakness, had his hand resting at the curve of Catherine's waist with the easy, unself-conscious certainty of a hand that has been welcome there before, that expects to be welcome again, that has no anxiety about its right to be exactly where it is, Bennett Northwood, lone-turned allied alpha of the western borders, a man Zev had assessed and respected in the abstract way you assess and respect a capable wolf you have never had cause to concern yourself with. He was concerned now. His jaw tightened, his chest cracked open with the specific, to quiet devastation of old wood splitting in winter, not violently, not suddenly, but along a line that has been weakening for a long time, and has finally found the moment it was always going to find. He had prepared for tonight, He had prepared the way he prepared for everything, thoroughly, in advance, with attention to all known variables. He had prepared for the council tensions and the alliance politics, and the required conversations with the Stoneclaw Patriarch about the Northern Boundary Survey. He had prepared for the questions about the upcoming spring ceremony, for Theodora's composed presence beside him, for 14 months of choices made and lived with and presented to the pack with the authority of a man who does not second-guess himself in public. He had not prepared for her, or he had not prepared for Catherine Mooncrest to look like that, steady and bright and entirely, completely settled in herself, not performing ease, not trying to project something, simply living at full volume in a room where he was present, and not even looking at him. He had not prepared for the possibility that she was not just surviving. He had not prepared for her to be more than fine. And then, as though she had felt the weight of 300 pounds of alpha attention land on her across the lodge, Catherine's eyes moved through the crowd and found him. One breath, a pause, half a second. Her expression shifted, not dramatically, not with the sharp performance of a woman making a point, but with the quiet efficiency of someone who has practiced precisely this contingency in private and knows exactly which face to wear. Polite, or distant, entirely composed, she was not shattered. She was not even close to shattered. She was settled in a way he had not known she could be, because the last time he had seen her, she had not been this settled. She had been on her way to becoming this. She had become it in the 14 months since, in whatever private and unglamorous and entirely her own way that becoming happened. And after one held breath, she turned back to Bennett Northwood and continued the conversation. She looked away first. Zev Oshfang, who had faced down rival alphas across the bloodied borders of contested territory, who had negotiated in smoke-filled rooms where the wrong sentence cost lives, who had walked into war and walked back out, had never, in the entire length of his adult life, had someone look at him and then look away. Not like that, or not with that gentle, exact, earned indifference. Shall I arrange a different position in the hall, Alpha? Montgomery's voice was very low, very neutral, a man delivering a practical option with no visible opinion about whether it was needed. Zev said nothing. That was the answer. He stood in the fire-lit lodge as the blood moon gathering continued around him, beautiful and ordinary, and entirely unbothered by what was happening in his chest. And he began, in the slow, specific, unavoidable way that truth arrives when you have run out of room to avoid it, to understand. She was not the one who was struggling tonight. She had never been going to struggle tonight. And he was the reason. Montgomery took the untouched ceremonial drink from his hand without being asked and placed it on a passing tray. This was the kind of thing a beta learns to do over 14 years of service. The small, invisible corrections that keep an alpha from showing the room what is happening inside him. The pack was watching. The pack was always watching, at a blood moon gathering, because the Alpha King's presence and composure were themselves a kind of political communication. Every gesture, every expression, every prolonged pause was being noted by 24 experienced eyes, and interpreted accordingly. Montgomery could remove the untouched drink. He could not remove the stillness. An Alpha King at the blood moon gathering is supposed to move through the hall like a current, to be the thing that other people orient themselves toward, the gravitational force that shapes the room without requiring the room's acknowledgement that it is being shaped. Hadzev had done this effortlessly for years. He had arrived at dozens of these gatherings in the last decade and moved through them with the specific, unhurried authority of a man for whom presence is not performed, but simply present. Tonight he stood at the entrance, and the room moved around him, and he was a stone in a river. He catalogued her the way he had always catalogued difficult terrain, precisely, completely, without mercy toward himself or what the inventory revealed. Catherine Mooncrest had changed, not in the simple, surface-level ways that time changes people, not thinner or harder or carrying herself with the performed dignity of a woman trying to make a point about having survived something. She was changed the way territory changes after a long season of rain. Still entirely itself, but deeper, more settled into its own contours, carrying more than it had before, and moving differently because of it. She wore ivory and warm amber, both colours luminous against her dark skin in the firelight. Her hair was pinned, as it always was at formal gatherings, largely contained, but with the particular looseness at the edges that suggested she had pinned it herself without particular concern for perfection. And there, on the side of her right hand, visible even across the length of the lodge, a small dark smudge. Paint. Ink. Something she had been doing before she arrived, and had not fully removed. He had noticed that about her the first time they spoke. The ink she never noticed. She was laughing at something Bennett Northwood had said. Not a polite laugh, not the measured, socially appropriate laugh of a woman managing a conversation, but a real one, the kind that arrived before she could calibrate it, the kind that she had always given to things that genuinely amused her in the 6 weeks when he had been close enough to learn the difference. Bennett Northwood was laughing too, genuinely, the way a man laughs when he is in the company of someone whose humour he did not see coming, and is entirely pleased to have encountered. His hand had not moved from her waist. It sat there with the ease of something that had been welcome before and expected to be welcome again, and had no uncertainty about any of this. Zev understood, with the slow and specific clarity of a man whose instincts have always been reliable, even when his choices have not, what that hand meant. It did not mean ownership or performance or political signalling. It meant ease, the accumulation of shared moments until a hand at someone's waist required no thought, no negotiation, no particular awareness of itself at all. Ease accumulates. Possession ends. He had spent his life understanding the difference between things that last and things that merely appear to. He had not applied that understanding correctly. And then, as though the weight of his attention had its own physical presence, which among wolves it sometimes did, the instinct for being watched translating directly into the body before the mind caught up. Catherine's eyes moved across the lodge and found him. One breath, a held pause. Her expression shifted. Not dramatically, not with the deliberate staging of a woman choosing her moment. With the quiet, depracticed efficiency of someone who had prepared for precisely this contingency in the private hours before the gathering. The warmth that had been in her face a moment before, entirely, genuinely there, shifted into something polite and distant and perfectly maintained, not shattered, not struggling, not carrying anything she had not chosen to carry. Settled. After that one held breath, she turned back to Bennett Northwood and continued the conversation. The laughter returned in a moment, smaller but real, at something he had said in response to whatever she had been saying before the interruption. She had looked away first. Zev had faced down rival alphas who carried 3 times his body weight in wolf form. He had negotiated in rooms where the wrong sentence meant border wars. He had walked into the worst days of 3 years of conflict, and walked back out with his territories intact, and his pack held together by will and the kind of personal authority that cannot be manufactured or taught. He had never been dismissed, not by anyone, not like that, not with such gentle, earned, entirely unconcerned indifference. Shall I arrange a different position in the hall, Alpha? Montgomery. Low. Neutral. Waiting. No, Zev said. He moved, not toward her, not toward the exit, but through the hall, toward the cluster of council members near the formal table, where the political conversations he had come to navigate were waiting with the patient indifference of duty that does not care about your feelings. He moved because standing still was no longer possible. He moved because Montgomery had started to look quietly alarmed. He moved because the Alpha King of 4 territories doesn't stand at the entrance of the Blood Moon, gathering looking like a man who has just understood something 14 months too late. But he carried it with him, across the fire-lit floor. The sight of her laughing, head tilted back, guard completely down, the weight of his own name in her eyes before she turned away, and the low, involuntary, swallowed sound that had escaped his throat before he could stop it. He had not prepared for her. He should have. Of all the things to prepare for, out of all the variables in a room full of pack politics and complicated alliances, and 14 months of choices made in public and lived with in private, he should have prepared for the simple, shattering fact that Catherine Mooncrest was going to look like that, and he was going to have to stand in the same room with it. He had not. He spent the rest of the gathering in the correct conversations, saying the correct things, performing the correct version of the Alpha King at the Blood Moon gathering. He did it well. He had always done it well. He did not look at her again that evening. He knew, without looking, exactly where she was in the room. For the first time in 14 months, through the winter administrative sessions and the spring alliance negotiations, and the summer border disputes, and the autumn Blood Moon gathering just concluded, he sat in the chair nearest his study window and watched the grey light come up over the Ashfang territorial forest without shifting. The shifting had been his anchor, his fixed point. Through 3 years of war, he had shifted at dawn without exception, shed the weight of command and strategy and loss and responsibility, and run through the dark of his own forests as the wolf he was beneath everything else. Come back steadier. Come back with the specific, clean-boned clarity of a man who has given his animal nature its time and been restored by it. This morning, the wolf did not want to run, but the wolf wanted to sit very still and think about a woman standing in a fire-lit hall, laughing, with another man's hand at her waist. Across the study, in the lower right drawer of his desk, sat a collection of letters he had written across the 14 months since Catherine Mooncrest left Mooncrest territory. Some were long. Some were barely a paragraph. Some had been begun and abandoned, and begun again on clean paper. All of them had remained in that drawer, unsent, because there was no version of sending them that did not make him the kind of man he refused to be. The kind who makes a choice with full knowledge of its consequences, and then reaches back toward what he chose to leave behind. He did not look at the drawer, but he was aware of it the way you are always aware of a window at your back. You cannot see it, but you know precisely where the light is coming from. He let himself remember, not because he wanted to, because the morning after the Blood Moon gathering had made avoidance no longer structurally possible. The war had come first. 3 years of interpack conflict that had taken his father in the 2nd year, killed in a border dispute that should never have been allowed to become a battle, gone before Zev had finished learning what it meant to be the son of a man like that, gone before he had understood that the learning was ongoing and would now have to happen differently. The Ashfang territories had fractured under the pressure. Allied packs had watched from a careful distance, calculating whether the new Alpha King would consolidate or collapse, for the Council had fallen into the particular disorder of bodies that have lost their certainty about who is actually in charge. The debts, political, financial, territorial, had accumulated with the indifferent efficiency of interest. He had come home from the final campaign to find his mother Penelope in the eastern receiving room, spine perfectly straight, hands folded in her lap, a cold tea on the table beside her that she hadn't touched in some time. She had been managing the household and the political correspondence and the accumulated anxieties of a pack that did not know whether its alpha would return, and she had managed all of it with the same contained, undemonstrative competence that had characterized her entire adult life. "The pack needs a Luna," she said, the first morning, no preamble. A fact being laid on the table like a map that needs to be walked. I know. Not simply any Luna. The pack has spent 3 years watching everything held together by a thread. They need to see that thread become a rope. They need someone who can walk into a room of rival alphas and make the alliance feel permanent rather than provisional. Someone polished, socially precise. Someone who understands what is required and is capable of providing it without needing to be asked twice. A pause. The kind of pause that contains a name. Theodora Mooncrest, she said. The elder daughter. She would be an excellent Luna in every way the pack requires. And then, more quietly, the sentence that had lived in the back of his awareness every day since. The younger, Catherine, is different. She reads territorial records for pleasure. She has challenged the northern boundary argument twice in Pack Council and been correct both times. She would not become your Luna. She would remain Catherine. And right now, the Pack cannot afford a Luna who insists on being herself before she is a symbol. He had not argued. His mother had not been wrong. Everyone who pressed him toward Theodora had done so with reasons that were accurate. That was the particular and relentless cruelty of the situation. There was no villain. No one had acted from malice. The council, his mother, Montgomery's careful and wordless agreement. All of it had come from people reading the situation correctly. The pack needed what it needed. Theodora was what the pack needed. But he had met Catherine 6 weeks before the Blood Moon gathering of the previous year, a small pack assembly. The kind of obligation he fulfilled without anticipation. He had walked in and found her standing near the fire in the main hall, and she was not performing attendance. She was reading. An actual territorial land record, spine bent, head down, entirely unbothered by the room's comfortable expectation that a young woman of the Mooncrest family at a pack gathering would be decorative rather than occupied. Her hair was pinned loosely. There was ink on the side of her right hand that she had not noticed. He had crossed the room toward her before he decided to. "You are reading the Northern Boundary Survey," he said. She looked up with the specific, unhurried attention of someone whose thoughts are genuinely interesting enough to be reluctant to interrupt. She assessed him without alarm or performance, and then she said, "The third revision, where someone moved the eastern marker 14 feet east of the original stake and wrote it up as a surveying correction. It is not a correction. It is a territorial claim, written to look administrative." He looked at the record. She was entirely right. 6 weeks of that. Conversations that moved into territory he had not expected, that asked things of him that no one in his orbit ever thought to ask, because everyone else had already decided they knew who he was and found the decision satisfying. Catherine never found it satisfying. She kept asking what was underneath the Alpha King, not provocatively, not as a test, but with the genuine curiosity of a person who believes that everyone contains more than their title and wants to know the more. He had found, to his own considerable astonishment, that there was still something there. But underneath the authority and the armor and the 10,000 expectations of a man whose name is a territorial marker, there was still a person. Someone who had opinions about the Northern Boundary Survey and about the ways that 3 years of war had changed the philosophical framework through which he understood leadership, and about the particular loneliness of being the gravitational center of every room you enter, and never, not once, being the one who is pulled toward someone else's gravity instead. Catherine had pulled him, without effort or strategy. simply by being genuinely interested in the answers to the questions she asked. He had called on Remington Mooncrest on a grey Tuesday morning and asked for Theodora. Remington had received the request with the quiet composure of a man who had perhaps expected it, or perhaps had been told to expect it by Eleanor, who thought in pack social arithmetic the way Zev thought in territorial maps. The conversation was brief and formal, and over before Zev entirely understood what he had done. Catherine had known before the formal announcement. Eleanor had told her that morning, efficiently, with the same practical precision she brought to everything. By the time Zev stood across the room from her at the following week's gathering, she had had 7 days to prepare. She had prepared well. She held a cup of tea she was not drinking, and stood near the window with an expression that disclosed almost nothing. And when his eyes found hers across the room, just once, just briefly, she said, quietly enough that only he could hear it, "I hope you know what you are doing, Alpha." He had not answered. There was no answer that was not a confession. 12 days later, she was gone. No scene, no letter, no dramatic farewell. Simply gone, north to her Aunt Beatrice Winterbourne's lodge, far beyond the reach of everything that had happened. And he had told himself what he needed to tell himself, that she was strong, that she would recover, that the choice had been necessary, and she would understand that eventually, and that the distance between them was the correct and honourable distance, given who he had chosen to become. He had told himself all of that, and had mostly believed it in the practiced way of a man who is very good at believing what he needs to believe in order to function. Until last night. Until the firelit lodge and the involuntary growl and the sight of Catherine Mooncrest laughing in the arms of a man who had recognized her and stayed. He sat in his study in the grey dawn, a cold tea at his elbow, the locked drawer containing 14 unsent letters in his peripheral vision, and allowed himself, for the first time, without excuse or revision or the architecture of justification he had been maintaining for 14 months, to know the truth. He had not chosen duty. He had chosen safety. He had dressed the choice in duty's clothing, because duty was a story he could live with, and the truth was not. The truth was simpler and harder, and considerably less noble. Catherine had frightened him, not because she was difficult or unpredictable or dangerous, because she had seen him, fully and accurately, and without the flattering distortions that authority tends to produce in the people around you. She had seen the man beneath the Alpha King, and she had found him interesting, and that, the specific vulnerability of being genuinely known, had felt more dangerous than war. Theodora was safe. Theodora was precise and composed and politically exact, and she would be an excellent Luna, and she would never, not once, ask him to be more than his title. That had not been an accident. He had chosen it on purpose. Outside, the Ashfang forest waited in the grey November light. The wolves of the dawn patrol moved through the trees at the edge of the territory. The pack was waking. The day was beginning. He sat in his chair and did not shift, or he sat with the cold tea and the unsent letters and the full weight of what the blood moon gathering had clarified, and he let himself know all of it. And then he picked up his pen. He had a pack to run. That, at least, had not changed. The work of becoming Catherine Mooncrest arrived at Beatrice Winterbourne's lodge in the Northern Highlands on a cold October morning, with one trunk and the specific, carefully maintained stillness of a woman who has decided that feeling things visibly is a luxury she cannot presently afford. Beatrice Winterbourne was 73 years old, sharp as winter glass, and had lived long enough to have zero patience for anything that resembled hiding wearing the face of healing. She had watched her niece step down from the carriage, reassessed the situation with the rapid precision of a woman whose intelligence had been honed rather than softened by age, and said nothing. For 3 full days, she said nothing. She showed Catherine to her room. She arranged meals at regular hours. She made the lodge available, its library, its grounds, its fire-lit sitting rooms, without comment or direction. She gave the grief its 3 days without interference. She did not perform sympathy or attempt consolation, or fill the silence with the well-intentioned noise of someone who cannot tolerate the sight of unhappiness. Beatrice Winterbourne had buried a mate. She knew what grief required. She knew what it did not require. On the 4th morning, at breakfast, she set down her tea and said, "You are not healing. You are hiding. There is a difference, and I will shelter the first one as long as it takes. The second one I will not shelter indefinitely. He chose your sister. That is a fact. Facts do not dissolve because we put distance between ourselves and the rooms that contain them. The only things that change facts are time and the work you choose to do with it. I have a library, a territory full of problems that need careful minds, and all the time in the world. What would you like to do with yours?" Catherine set down her own cup. She looked at her aunt across the breakfast table, at the sharp eyes and the straight back, and the complete absence of any cushioning in the delivery, and she said, because Beatrice had never responded well to anything less than total honesty, "I do not know yet." "Good," said Beatrice. "That is the only answer that is not a performance. I'll come to the library after breakfast. We will begin there and see what useful looks like." What useful looked like in Beatrice Winterbourne's lodge was not glamorous and was not swift. It was territorial correspondence. Packs along the northern border sent disputes to Beatrice as a recognized neutral elder. Boundary questions, resource disagreements, the complicated territorial negotiations of wolves who have lived next to each other long enough to have accumulated grievances. These disputes required someone with a clear head and a precise mind, and the ability to read through political positioning to the actual underlying problem. Catherine had all of this. She had always had all of this. She had simply spent too many years in rooms that expected her to be pleasant and decorative rather than precise and useful. There was a quiet satisfaction in discovering that the quality she had always been slightly embarrassed by, the tendency to read territorial records at formal gatherings, to notice when a surveying correction was actually a territorial claim, was, in the right context, genuinely valuable. That her mind was not a liability or an eccentricity, but an instrument. A good one. One she had not been using correctly. Beatrice's social circle helped. They were mostly of her age, older wolves who had lived fully and had stopped performing anything they didn't feel like performing. They had opinions. They stated them. They expected Catherine to have opinions and were visibly unimpressed by deflection. She found, over the course of several dinners that ran longer than planned, that she had considerably more opinions than she had been allowing herself to express. They were, as it turned out, good opinions. They held up under challenge. They improved under engagement. She walked, not decorative turns around a garden, but actual territory. The northern highlands, frost-edged trails through pine and stone, landscape that didn't care how she felt and simply required that she keep moving. The wolf in her appreciated this most. The wolf had always been better at forward than at still, and there was the slow, daily, entirely unglamorous work of a woman rebuilding her understanding of what she was worth. Not what she was worth to the Mooncrest family name. Not what she was worth to the pack's social calculations. Not what she was worth in the context of a man who had not chosen her. What she was worth, alone, but in an empty room, with no one watching and nothing to perform. It took 4 months for the answer to stop feeling like a question she was being tested on. By February, she was sleeping properly. By April, she was laughing at Beatrice's dry observations, without having to remind herself that laughing was allowed. By June, she was producing territorial analyses that Beatrice passed along to the Northern Councils with her name attached and without any editorial modification. By August, she ran every morning through the Highland trails before breakfast and came back feeling like herself rather than like someone approximating herself. In August, Beatrice set down her tea. "Go back," she said. "The territory needs to see you well, and more importantly, and I say this because I think you need to hear it stated directly, you need to see yourself well within it. You have done the private work. The private work matters. But there is public work too, and they are not the same, and both are required. Go home, Catherine. You are ready." For the first time, the thought of returning did not sit in her chest like a stone. It felt like opening a door she already knew the layout of, a room she had lived in her whole life, that she had reorganized and repainted and rearranged in her absence, and was now returning to inhabit on her own terms. She went back in September. Juliet Stoneclaw called within the week, warm and genuine. Preston Wolfhart stopped her on the village road and said, in his characteristically minimal fashion, that she looked well. And from Preston, well, that was practically a formal welcome speech. Theodora came alone, without their mother, which told Catherine everything about the nature of the visit. They sat in the Mooncrest family sitting room, with tea between them and the particular, loaded quiet of two women who love each other and have been placed by circumstances on opposite sides of something neither of them designed or desired. They did not speak of Zev. They spoke of the Ashfang Lodge's library, which Theodora described as surprisingly excellent and slightly disorganized. They spoke of a minor disagreement with the estate housekeeper that had been resolved through the application of patient firmness. They spoke of ordinary things, in the careful way of two people testing whether ordinary is still possible between them. By the time Theodora left, something had settled. Not resolved, not explained, simply settled enough to breathe around, which was, Catherine thought, probably the most realistic thing to hope for. Eleanor came the following day with the specific expression she always wore when she had prepared something and was not entirely certain of its reception, a combination of relief and satisfaction and warning that she had never quite learned to separate into their individual components. She said, "You are back. Good. Hold your head up. You were never to blame, and every sensible wolf in the territory knows it, the closest her mother had ever come to an apology." Catherine accepted it for exactly what it was, and said thank you, and meant it. Bennett Northwood arrived in October, or he had come for Preston Wolfhart's horses and the quiet of a territory where no one knew him well enough to be careful around him. 2 years a widower, tired of being handled, tired of the careful warmth that people extend toward the newly recovered, as though grief were a convalescence that required a particular social posture from everyone nearby. He was not fragile. He had been through something real and terrible, and had continued living. That was all. It did not require management. He appeared at the end of the long dinner table at Wolfhart Lodge on a Tuesday evening in October, and Catherine had said something, precise and true, and unexpectedly funny in the same breath. And he had laughed before he could decide whether to. They had ended up, by the natural gravity of interesting conversation, at the same end of the table, are discussing, of all things, the management of impossible situations. "I have a method," Bennett said. "Problems I cannot solve go on the left side of my desk. Problems I am actively avoiding go on the right side. Every morning I look at both piles, feel appropriately terrible about the entire state of things, and then go for a run. When I get back, at least 2 of the problems have begun solving themselves through sheer time, and I feel capable of addressing one of the others directly." Catherine laughed, without calibration, without checking whether it was the right size for the room. Simply laughed. "That is either the most honest system I have ever heard described," she said, "or a complete failure of executive function disguised as philosophy." "Both," he said, pleasantly and without defensiveness. "In my experience, they travel together more often than not. The honest and the dysfunctional are not as mutually exclusive as leadership manuals would suggest." Something in her, that evening, loosened. Barely perceptibly, but enough to notice, in the way you notice a muscle unclenching that you had forgotten was clenched. The night before the blood moon gathering, Catherine sat at the window of her family's lodge and looked out at the dark pine forest stretching away toward the Ashfang territories in the distance. She did not feel afraid. She felt the presence of tomorrow as a thing she was equipped to walk into, rather than a thing she had to survive. She thought about the word arrived. Not yet, but close. And the distance remaining, she could see it clearly, and she was not afraid of it, and that itself was a kind of arrival. She pressed her hands flat on the cold windowsill and let herself want things without checking whether the wanting was appropriate. Tomorrow she would walk into the blood moon gathering and carry everything she had built with her. She intended to carry it well. 3 days after the blood moon gathering, Zev accepted an invitation he would normally have delegated. A smaller pack assembly, territorial council in the afternoon, followed by an informal gathering at Juliet Stoneclaw's lodge. The kind of event that did not require an Alpha King's personal presence, and would not have received it under normal circumstances. Montgomery noted the change in the itinerary without comment, which was its own kind of commentary. Catherine had known from the morning Juliet mentioned the gathering 2 days before that Zev might attend, while she had given herself a single evening to consider how she would manage the possibility, and had arrived at a conclusion with the same calm precision she brought to territorial analyses, with composure, with the distance that comes not from coldness, but from a woman who knows what she is worth and does not require external confirmation of it, with the specific authority of 14 months of unglamorous private work carried in her body and her bearing like something she had earned. She had not prepared for him to cross the room deliberately. She watched him come. Through the comfortable afternoon crowd of Juliet's lodge, past the Wolfhart brothers and a small cluster of younger pack members near the fire, and she watched him come with the particular readiness of a woman who has rehearsed composed indifference and is now discovering what it actually feels like to need it. She did not look away. At the gathering, looking away had been instinct, a self-protective reflex she had not chosen and could not have stopped. This was different. This was a choice. She stood in the warm, fire-lit afternoon of Juliet's sitting room and watched Zev Ashfang cross the floor toward her, and she chose not to look away. Not as a statement, not as defiance, simply as a decision made by a woman who has stopped organizing her choices around someone else's comfort. He stopped at a correct, formal distance. His expression was the one she had always recognized as his working face, composed, commanding, disclosing nothing that had not been deliberately disclosed. But the jaw was tight. She had learned, in 6 weeks of genuine attention, to read the jaw. It meant something was costing him effort to contain. Miss Mooncrest, Alpha. The two most ordinary words in either of their vocabularies. They sat in the air between them like stones in cold water, solid and unchanging, and exactly what they were. He asked if she was well. She said she was. He said he had not known she had returned to the territory until the gathering, which was true. She had returned quietly, without announcement, without the kind of re-entry that requires an audience. She said she had come back in September. The county had been welcoming. She was glad to be home. He said he was glad of that. And she could see, in the jaw, in the precise, careful quality of the delivery, that he meant it, that the meaning of it was costing him something. Theodora mentioned the spring ceremony preparations, Catherine said, in the same pleasant and entirely level tone she might use to discuss the upcoming hunting season. She seems very settled in the Ashfang Lodge. No edge. That was what made it so exact. There was no edge in the sentence, because she had genuinely moved Theodora and Zev's arrangement into the part of her mind that held facts she could engage with, rather than wounds she needed to manage. It was not that she had resolved everything, or forgiven everything, or ceased to carry anything at all. It was that she had built a self large enough that the fact of it, the fact of what had happened, of what had been chosen, did not occupy the center of her life anymore. She had moved it to the edges. Facts live at the edges, but once you have made a genuine peace with them. He said her name. Catherine. Something crossed her face, brief and contained, like wind over still water that does not stay disturbed. A flicker of something, there and then gone. She did not suppress it, exactly. She simply did not amplify it. She let it pass through, and then she let it go. Alpha, she said, gently, clearly. The word as a wall, but a polite one. A wall that acknowledges someone without inviting them further in. The room continued its ordinary afternoon around them. Juliet was laughing with the elder Wolfhart near the bookcase. The ceremonial tea was being passed. Someone near the fire was telling a story that was apparently quite funny, given the response. The world, thoroughly and helpfully unbothered. I should return to Lady Stoneclaw, Catherine said. She was telling me about the new Northern Boundary Survey. The Eastern Marker revision is interesting. She walked away with the quiet, specific steadiness that was entirely hers. Not a performance of dignity. Not a statement. A woman returning to a conversation she had found genuinely interesting. She did not look back. Zev stood at the edge of the sitting room. He watched her return to Juliet's side and lean in with genuine attention at whatever the older woman was saying. He watched the warmth return to her expression. He watched her take a cup of tea from the passing tray with the automatic ease of someone who knows her own preferences and does not second-guess them. He watched her be fine, not performing fine, not trying to appear fine while managing something else underneath. Simply fine. Living, a fully and without apology or awareness of his presence in a room where he was standing. He understood now, with the slow and specific and entirely unmerciful clarity of a man who has finally run out of room to be anything other than honest with himself. The locked drawer and the 14 months of telling himself that the choice had been duty and sacrifice and the necessary burden of leadership, they had not resolved anything. They had delayed it, and delays accumulate cost. Every alpha who has survived long enough knows that delays are not avoidances. They are simply payments deferred. He had chosen fear. He had chosen it with full information and had called it something else. And the woman he had chosen it over had gone north and done 14 months of unglamorous private work, and come back carrying something he was not going to be able to name without it breaking something else open in his chest. She had not needed him to be fine. She had not needed him at all. That was the specific, clean, precise truth of what the Blood Moon Gathering and this afternoon had together clarified. The window was closed. It had closed because he had closed it, and it was not going to reopen because Catherine Mooncrest had done the far more difficult thing of continuing to live after a window shut, and had found, in that living, something considerably better than the view from the window she had lost. The council members are assembling in the eastern room. Alpha. Montgomery. Quiet. Patient. Present. Zev turned from the sitting room. He did not look back across the lodge. He carried the weight of the afternoon with him, the weight of his own name spoken in his voice, and her gentle, clear, entirely finished answer. and went to do the work he had chosen. The pack, the territory, for the life he had built from the choice he had made. He was going to live inside it completely. That was the only honourable thing left to do. Bennett Northwood had not come to Mooncrest territory looking for anything other than rest. He had come for Preston Wolfhart's horses, good, solid northern stock that performed without theatrics and recovered without complaint, and for the particular quiet of a territory where no one knew him well enough to treat him carefully. He had been a widower for 2 years, and he had grown exceptionally tired of the careful warmth people extended toward him, the slightly lowered voices, the gentled sentences, the invitations issued and then revised when the issuer remembered his circumstances. He was not fragile. He had been through something real and terrible, and had survived it without pretending it had not happened, and had continued living with the same practicality he brought to everything else. That was all grief was, ultimately, the continuation of living, in the presence of loss, without requiring the loss to be resolved before you continued. Then Catherine had said something at the Wolfhart dinner, precise and true and unexpectedly funny in the same breath, and he had laughed before he could decide whether to, and everything after that had been, in the quietest and most inevitable way, already decided. He had catalogued what he liked, because he was Bennett Northwood, and he processed things by being honest with himself about them. Her mind first, or the way she engaged with a problem, not to demonstrate that she was engaging, but because she was genuinely interested in where it led. The way she had disagreed with him 3 times in the first 2 weeks of their acquaintance, and had been right twice and wrong once, and had acknowledged the third with the same breezy directness she applied to everything, without requiring the error to become a performance of humility. The way she listened with the specific, weighted attention of a person who actually intends to revise her thinking if the argument is good enough. The way she had been through something real, and had not let it make her brittle or cautious or closed. She was open, not naively, not blindly, but with the specific open quality of a person who has chosen openness after having every legitimate reason to choose otherwise. He recognized this. He had had to make the same choice himself. He had seen Zev cross the floor toward her at Juliet's lodge, had heard the details of what followed from Clara Wolfhart, brief, polite, exactly contained on both sides, and had sat with that information for 2 days. Had turned it over, had been honest with himself about what he felt, which was not the territorial possessiveness of a man who has claimed something he does not wish to lose. What he felt was something quieter and more specific, a strong disinclination to be the kind of man who mistakes patience for wisdom. He had been patient, with his own grief, with the slow work of learning to want things again after losing the person he had organized his wanting around. He understood patience from the inside. He also understood that patience, in certain contexts, communicated the wrong thing entirely. To a woman who had been told in the most definitive way possible that she was the second choice, steadiness could look like indifference. Consistency could look like a man who is content to let things remain comfortable rather than risk saying something true. He did not want her to mistake his steadiness for indifference. She was not filling time for him. She had never been that. Not from the first Tuesday evening at the Wolfhart dinner table. He rode to the Mooncrest family lodge on a Thursday afternoon in mid-November. Sent a note the evening before, brief, matter-of-fact, using his formal handwriting because some things warranted the effort. Was admitted by the housekeeper. Shown to the back sitting room, where he stopped in the doorway. Or the large canvas against the far wall, the painting Catherine had mentioned once in passing, briefly and without detail, and then changed the subject, was finished. And he stood in the doorway and looked at it the way he looked at things he wanted to understand. Fully, without performance, taking whatever time the understanding required. A woman standing at a window. back to the viewer, her hands loose at her sides, her reflection visible in the glass, looking outward. The woman looking at her own reflection, not sad, not triumphant. Something quieter and more complete than either. The expression, rendered not in the face, since the face was not visible, but in the entire language of the body, of a woman who has arrived somewhere real after a long journey, not the arrival of triumph, the arrival of having come all the way. Catherine was still at the easel, her back to him, cleaning a brush with the automatic ease of long practice. There was ochre near her hairline, faint and not quite washed out. He had noticed this quality in her from the very beginning, the small traces of where her actual attention had been, the evidence of real engagement left behind on her person without notice or apology. "You have paint near your hairline," he said. She turned, considered the remark with the equanimity she brought to most things, and said, "I frequently do. Sit down, Ashp." The use of his given name was its own small thing that was not small. He sat. She rinsed the brush, dried her hands, settled across from him with the particular quality of focused attention she had given him since the first evening, and waited. "Why, you look as though you have something to say," she said. "I do." "Then say it." He did not perform nervousness. He did not perform confidence either. He simply looked at her with the same honest attention she had always given him and said, "I want to ask you to bond with me. Not because the arrangement is convenient, or because it is the next logical step in a sequence, or because it satisfies any political or social calculus. Because I find you extraordinary. Because I want the rest of my life to include you as fully as possible. Because I recognized you, from the very beginning, at that dinner table in October. And I do not want to be the man who recognized something remarkable and then was too careful to say so directly. That is the entire reason. There is no other reason underneath it." The sitting room was quiet, but the November light through the windows was pale and thin and very honest. Catherine looked at him for a long moment. Not managing the moment, simply present in it, with the full, weighted attention she brought to things that mattered. "I want to be honest with you," she said. "I have not fully arrived yet. I do not mean I am holding on to something from the past. I am not. I mean I am still in the process of understanding what I want and what I want my life to be, and I will not receive what you have just said and answer it with a certainty I do not yet honestly possess." He nodded. "I am not asking for certainty," he said. "I am asking for honesty. You have just given me honesty. That is enough for now. That is more than enough." Something in her loosened, not collapse, release. The specific, the quiet release of a woman who has been braced against something for longer than she realized, and has just discovered it is no longer necessary. "You are a very reasonable man," she said, the observation of a quality she was still getting used to encountering. "I have been called worse," he said. She laughed, the laugh that did not check itself before arriving, and Clara Wolfhart appeared an hour later and stayed, and the afternoon became evening without anyone being particularly concerned about it. And when Bennett rode back through the November dark, the words he had said felt less like a question waiting for an answer, and more like a thing that had been stated and received, and was now simply present between them. That night, Catherine sat at the window of her room and thought about locked drawers and unlocked ones. She thought about the drawer in her writing desk where she kept Bennett's 2 November letters, the fact that she had not locked it, not forgotten to, not chosen not to, out of some statement-making, but genuinely had no need to. The letters were just there, available. Ordinary in the way that things are ordinary, when they are simply part of your life rather than evidence of something you are managing. She thought about the difference between a feeling that had arrived like a storm, fast, disorienting, total, impossible to stand inside without losing your footing, and this that had arrived like a season, gradually, quietly, until one day she had looked at the shape of her days and found Bennett Northwood in the center of them, already there, already known, and already essential in the way that essential things become without announcing themselves. She thought about his faults, which she now knew well, the genuine disorganization he found quietly amusing in himself, the way he was occasionally too accommodating with people who did not deserve accommodation, the way he fell asleep in chairs after large dinners and woke slightly embarrassed about it, the strong and occasionally unreasonable opinions about the correct way to manage a horse in difficult weather. She knew all of it. She liked him anyway, which was, she understood, the more durable thing. She pressed her hands flat on the cold windowsill and let herself want the future without checking first whether the wanting was appropriate. It was enough. It was the beginning. De Clarkson Nightcrest delivered difficult information the way he delivered everything, without preamble, without visible opinion, with the specific loyalty of a man who has served long enough to understand that his alpha prefers facts clean and unadorned. Lord Bennett Northwood made a formal approach to Sir Remington Mooncrest yesterday afternoon. The meeting lasted the better part of an hour. Sir Remington was seen at the door afterward looking, "These are the Wolfhart coachman's words, sir. Very pleased indeed." Zev set down his pen. He looked at the paragraph he had just been writing. Something about the Eastern Territorial Boundary Survey, the same survey Catherine had been reading near the fire when he had first crossed a room toward her without deciding to. The words had become shapes without meaning. "Thank you, Clarkson," he said. And Clarkson withdrew with the quiet efficiency of a man who knows when his presence is no longer required. The study settled into its winter silence. Outside, the first December frost had found the Ashfang territory, and the forest beyond the window was precise and glittering and cold. Zev sat. He had known this was coming. He had seen it at the gathering and understood it at Juliet's lodge, and felt it with the specific, helpless clarity of a man watching something develop that he has no standing to prevent and no honorable reason to try. He had known, in the private part of himself, that he could not quite govern into silence, that Bennett Northwood was going to ask, and that Remington Mooncrest, a quietly shrewd man who communicated love through small, deliberate gestures, and had always seen Catherine with the patient, undemonstrative accuracy of a father who knew exactly who he had been given, was going to say yes with the kind of pleasure that comes from watching something go right after watching it go wrong. He had known all of this. He had prepared in the way he prepared for everything, for the arrival of the fact, dead and still. Clarkson's flat, neutral delivery had arrived like a door closing in a room he was still standing in. The feeling surprised him. Not anger. He had no standing for anger, and he knew it. Not the territorial possessiveness that the wolf in him was capable of in other contexts. What arrived was something much quieter and considerably more honest than either of those things. Loss. Pure and clean and without qualification. The loss of understanding, finally and completely, what he had walked away from. Made fully real by the fact that someone else was walking toward it. And being welcomed, warmly, genuinely, with the particular pleasure of a father who has spent a year hoping for exactly this. He had not caused lasting harm. He had told himself for 14 months that he would not, and he had been technically accurate. She was not broken. She was not diminished. She was not walking through her life with the specific hollowness of someone carrying a wound that has not healed. She was simply building a life that did not require him, and she was building it well, with a man who had recognized her at a dinner table and had said true things directly and had been patient without being passive, and had eventually decided that patience was being mistaken for indifference, and had corrected the misunderstanding. She was no longer his. She had perhaps never been. Not in the way that the word his actually meant, not in the way he had refused to fully acknowledge wanting her to be, because the wanting had frightened him, and the fear had dressed itself as duty, and he had lived inside the costume for 14 months and called it honor, and in a quiet corner of him that he had not fully examined until now had lived the vague, unacknowledged notion that some part of her story still had room for him, that the chapter was not entirely closed, that the weight was mutual, even if the choices hadn't been. That corner had just been permanently corrected. Theodora arrived that afternoon. She came with the spring ceremony documents, the bonding preparations that needed to begin now if everything was to be ready by April. She set them on his desk with her usual composed efficiency, and stopped. She looked at his face with the steady, dark eyes that were her mother Eleanor's eyes, and she read him with the accuracy she always brought to rooms and people and situations. And then she said, carefully, "I heard about Lord Northwood's call at the family lodge." He met her eyes. "But I am not making an accusation," she said. "Level, precise. I am not asking anything of you. I am telling you that I am aware of it, and that I think it is genuinely good news." A pause, small and exact. "My sister deserves someone who chose her first." The sentence arrived in the study with the quiet, absolute weight of a thing that has been true for a long time and has finally been spoken. Not cruelly, not as a blade, simply as a truth, stated by a woman composed enough to say it without needing it to damage anything. He wanted to respond. He found that there was nothing he could say that would not open a door he had committed, in full public knowledge, to keeping closed. He and Theodora were not a love match. They both knew this, had known it from the first conversation, while had built something functional and genuinely respectful from the materials available. She was an excellent Luna. She was composed and politically precise, and she managed the Ashfang Lodge with the same quiet competence she brought to everything. They had made an arrangement in good faith, and they both honored it in good faith. "Theodora," he said. "Open the documents," she said, without inflection, without either cruelty or comfort, simply moving forward, because forward was the only direction that served either of them. She opened the ceremony documents and described the spring preparations with the same efficient composure she brought to everything. He stood beside her. He said the appropriate things and meant them with the full sincerity of a man who takes his obligations seriously, because that was who he was, and that was the thing that had not changed, and was not going to change. He honored what he committed to, even the commitments made in the wrong season from the wrong place, for a reason he had only lately been honest enough to name correctly. But something had shifted, small and irreversible, the way a key turning changes a lock even after the key is gone. She had said a true thing, without cruelty, without collapse, without requiring anything in return. She had said it, and it was now in the room with them, permanent and quiet, and it was going to remain there. Not as an accusation or a grief, but as a fact. The kind that two people who are honest with each other eventually have to be able to hold between them without either of them falling. After she left, Zev stood at the window for a long time. He let himself know all of it. What without the self-narration, without the architecture of justification, he had been maintaining since the grey Tuesday morning when he had sat in Remington Mooncrest's study and made a choice he had spent the following 14 months calling something more noble than what it was. He had chosen fear. He had honored it with his full effort and his full integrity and the entire weight of who he was. That was real. The integrity with which he had lived inside the wrong choice did not make the choice right, but it was not nothing. A man who chooses wrong and then lives right is not lost. He is simply, specifically, and permanently without the particular thing he chose against. That was what he was. Catherine Mooncrest was going to become Catherine Northwood, or whatever form her life with Bennett took on the terms she set. She was going to build something with a man who had seen her clearly and said so, and had been steady enough to be trusted, and honest enough to be believed. She was going to paint on blank canvases, and read territorial surveys, and ask questions that cut to the real issue, and laugh without checking whether the laugh was the right size. He hoped all of it for her, not as a performance of generosity, as a genuine wish from a man who had loved something, and, in fear, let it go, and who was adult enough to want the thing he had loved to flourish in the absence of his presence. He picked up his pen. He had a pack to run, a bond ceremony to prepare, a life full of purpose and the kind of meaning that comes from doing difficult things with integrity. That was going to have to be enough. He was going to make it enough. The first real frost of December arrived overnight. It came the way the best and most permanent things come, quietly, while everything was still, while no one was watching, so that when Catherine woke and looked out the window, the entire garden had been transformed. Every branch, every edge, every flat surface covered in the precise, glittering work of cold accumulating until it became visible. The pines beyond the garden fence stood with their needles frosted over, each one individually caught, the whole forest become something exactly itself, but more so. She stood at the window for a moment, her morning tea warm in both hands, and thought about accumulation, about the way things become what they are going to be by degrees, so gradual that you only recognize the destination when you have fully arrived. Then she dressed and went downstairs to face the blank canvas. The large painting, the woman at the window, the reflection, the hands loose at the sides, had been moved from the easel 3 weeks ago and leaned carefully against the sitting-room wall. She had looked at it every morning and found nothing she wanted to change, which was the truest signal a piece of work was complete. Not satisfaction, which was unreliable. Not pride, which was complicated. The simple absence of the urge to improve. The work had become itself. There was nothing left to do to it. She stood in front of it in the December morning light and looked at it for a long time, at the woman who was not sad and not triumphant, but simply, quietly, there, at the reflection looking outward with its own kind of possibility. Then she moved it gently aside and set a clean canvas on the fresh easel. No plan, no preliminary sketch, no expectation about what it would become. That was always how she began the things that turned out best. She had been standing before the blank white surface for perhaps 20 minutes, thinking about nothing specific and everything in general when she heard Bennett's horse in the front drive. She had known he was coming. He had sent word the previous evening in his handwriting, using the slightly more careful version he reserved for things that mattered. The note said, "I would like to call tomorrow afternoon, if that suits," which from Bennett meant, "I have something to say, and I want to say it in person, and the question of whether it suits is a courtesy, because I think you will want to hear it." She wiped her hands on the cloth by the easel. There was paint on 2 of her fingers, the faint trace of the ochre from earlier in the week that had not quite washed out. She looked at it and left it. He came into the back sitting room the way he always entered rooms, without announcement, without performance. Present. He stopped in the doorway when he saw the finished painting leaning against the wall, and he looked at it the way he had always looked at things he wanted to understand, fully, without performance, taking whatever time the understanding required. "The reflection is different from the woman," he said. "Yes," she said. The reflection is looking outward. The woman is looking at the reflection. Yes. He turned to look at her directly. That is a very honest painting, Catherine. I am a very honest painter, she said. Sit down. But he sat. She brought tea. The kettle had been ready since she heard his horse, and they settled into the comfortable, unforced quiet that had become, over the weeks of their acquaintance, one of the things she valued most. Two people who did not need to fill space with words to feel secure in each other's company. The pale gold December light came through the sitting-room windows, the particular gentle gold of a winter afternoon that is doing its sincere and honest best. I have something to ask you, he said. I know, she said. He looked briefly surprised, then amused, then honest. Was it that obvious? You used your formal handwriting in the note, she said. You only do that when something matters enough to be worth the effort. He made the face she had come to love. The self-deprecating expression of a man who has caught himself in a transparency he had not entirely intended, and is more amused than embarrassed by it. It was one of her favorite things about him. The steadiness was real. The vulnerability underneath was also real. He did not pretend otherwise. He set down his tea. I want to ask you to bond with me, he said. And then, because he was Bennett Northwood, and he said the complete true thing, rather than the strategically sufficient version. Not because the arrangement is convenient, or because it is the natural outcome of where we have been, or because it satisfies any political purpose, or suits any social calculation. Because I find you extraordinary. Because I want the rest of my life to include you as fully as possible. Because... He paused, and she recognized in the pause the specific vulnerability of a man being completely honest, without the protection of performance. I recognized you. From the very beginning, at that dinner table in October, I recognized you. And I do not want to be the man who recognized something extraordinary, and then was too careful to say so. The sitting room was entirely quiet. The pale December light came through the windows. Catherine looked at this man, at the two piles on his desk, and the tendency to fall asleep in chairs after large dinners, and the completely unreasonable opinions about northern horses in wet weather. Or at the man who had heard about Zev crossing the room at Juliet's lodge, and had sat with that information for 2 days, and then come and said a true thing, rather than waiting to see if the situation would resolve itself conveniently. At the man who had been through something real and terrible, and had continued living without requiring everyone around him to manage the continuing. She thought about locked drawers and unlocked ones. She thought about the painting behind them, the woman at the window, the reflection, the hands loose at the sides, about the long and unglamorous and entirely private work of learning what you see when you look at yourself honestly, without the distortion of other people's expectations or other people's choices. She thought about the difference between a feeling that arrives like a storm, fast and total and impossible to stand inside without losing your footing, electrifying and disorienting, and leaving everything rearranged in its wake. And this feeling that had arrived like a season, so gradually and so completely, and with such natural, unannounced warmth that by the time she registered it fully, it had already been present for a long time. Already familiar. Already the thing that was simply there. She thought about the unlocked drawer, the 2 letters inside it, the way she moved through her writing desk every morning and never once thought to lock that drawer, because there was nothing in it that needed protecting. It was just her life, the ordinary, present, real texture of her life. She thought about the blank canvas on the easel behind him. No plan. That was how she began the things that turned out best. Yes, she said. Simple. Complete. Without hesitation and without qualification. Ashby. Yes. He exhaled, and she heard in that exhale the specific sound of a man who had been more uncertain than he allowed himself to show. The steadiness real, the vulnerability underneath it also real, and the relief of both of them finally acknowledged. He reached across the small table between them and took her hand. She let him. They sat in the pale December light, with the honest painting behind them, and the blank canvas waiting, and the tea going slightly cold between them, and the room settled the way the right things settle, not dramatically, not with the swelling of something long suspended finally released, but with the quiet, permanent quality of something that has arrived and intends to stay. Nothing spectacular. Simply real. Simply true. The news reached Zev Ashfang on a Friday morning. His mother Penelope told him directly, as she always had, because she was Penelope, and she had always believed that the kindest form of difficult information was accurate information, delivered clearly and without embellishment, by someone who loved the recipient and trusted them to receive it. Bennett Northwood has asked for Catherine Mooncrest, she said, from across the desk in his study, sitting in the chair she always took, straight-spined, hands folded, tea on the table beside her. She has accepted. Remington is very pleased. Zev was writing a report about the Eastern Territorial boundaries, the same survey. He finished the sentence he had begun before she spoke. He set the pen down carefully. He looked at his mother across the desk, at the woman who had loved him long enough and clearly enough to tell him hard things without softening them, who was looking at him now with eyes that saw everything and said nothing unnecessary. Good, he said. It was the truest thing he had said in weeks, not because it did not cost him. It cost him considerably. It cost him in the specific and clean way that things cost you when you have made a wrong choice and have been honest about it, and are now living inside the permanent consequence of it with as much integrity as you can manage. But it was good. Genuinely, completely, without qualification, good. She was going to build a life with someone who had chosen her first, who had recognized her at a dinner table in October, and had said so directly without strategy, and had been steady enough to be trusted and honest enough to be believed. She was going to wake up in the mornings next to a man who had 2 piles on his desk and fell asleep in chairs and laughed at his own transparency with the ease of someone who has nothing to perform. She was going to be seen, daily, by someone who had decided that seeing her clearly was one of the great privileges of his life. He was capable of knowing that was good even while it hurt. That was perhaps the only form of growth that actually meant anything. Penelope sat, poured tea with the quiet efficiency of long practice. The ceremony preparations require your attention by the end of the month, she said, moving forward, because forward was the only direction that served. I will see to it, he said. She rose, and before she left, she rested her hand on his shoulder, briefly just long enough for the warmth of it to be real. The wordless thing a mother says when words are not enough and are not required. Then she was gone. The study settled into its December quiet. Zev sat for a long time. He let himself think about an autumn pack assembly, and a woman near the fire with a territorial record in her hands, and ink she had not noticed on her right hand. He let himself think about 6 weeks of conversations that had asked things of him that no one else had thought to ask. He let himself think about the sound of a growl swallowed in a firelit lodge, and the sight of eyes finding his across a crowd, and the specific expression of a woman who has done 14 months of private work and arrived somewhere permanent and real. He hoped she remained exactly herself. The ink and the opinions and the paintings that told the truth. He hoped Bennett understood what he had been given. He suspected he did. That was the particular, specific quality of the man, that he recognized the value of things and didn't pretend otherwise. Zev picked up his pen. He had a pack to run, A bond ceremony to prepare, a territory that needed its alpha's full attention and would receive it, a life that was full of meaning and purpose, and the particular substance that comes from choosing difficult things with integrity and living inside them completely. It was enough. It was genuinely, completely, finally enough. Across the territory, or in the back sitting room of the Mooncrest family lodge, Catherine stood before the clean canvas on the fresh easel. The December light came through the window and fell across the white surface. Pale gold, honest, patient. She picked up her brush. No plan, no expectation, no awareness of the small, dark smudge of paint on the side of her right hand that she had not noticed. She pressed the brush to the canvas. She began. She did not look back. She did not need to.